January 14, 1945. Skies above Lingayen Gulf, Philippines. The pencil trembled slightly as Major William Dunham recorded the mission in his logbook. Words that would have seemed like madness just 18 months earlier, when conventional fighter doctrine emphasized altitude as life itself. Approach target at 15 feet above water. Japanese gunners never adjusted in time. 850 calibers at 400 yards. Direct hits on ammunition dump. Secondary explosions observed. Through the sweat-streaked canopy of his F-4U Corsair, he had just demonstrated a tactic that contradicted everything pilots had been taught since the First World War. Instead of maintaining the safety of altitude, his squadron had deliberately descended to mere feet above the wavetops, using the glare of morning sun and the roar of surf to mask their approach until the last possible moment. The Japanese anti-aircraft gunners manning their carefully positioned 25mm batteries never had time to react. One moment they were scanning the mid-altitude approaches where American aircraft traditionally appeared, and the next moment 8 Pratt & Whitney-powered fighters were howling directly at them at over 350 miles per hour, their massive propellers nearly touching the whitecaps. The mathematics of tactical surprise were being rewritten not in climbing performance or service ceiling, but in the terrifying physics of 12,000-pound fighters appearing literally from below the horizon, delivering devastating firepower and vanishing before defensive weapons could be brought to bear. Dunham destroyed 3 coastal defense positions that day using these tactics, earning the Distinguished Flying Cross for his actions supporting the Luzon landings. But his success represented just one example of a fundamental transformation in air combat doctrine that had begun in mid-1943 and would reshape the strategic calculus of the Pacific War. The conventional wisdom passed down from World War I aces, like Eddie Rickenbacker, had been unambiguous. Altitude is life. Height is safety. This principle had governed fighter operations since the earliest days of aerial combat. The pilot with superior altitude could choose when and how to engage, could dive to attack and climb to escape, could convert potential energy to kinetic energy at will. Every fighter pilot learned this doctrine from their first training flights. Yet by 1944, elite American fighter units across the Pacific Theater were deliberately abandoning this cardinal rule, developing tactics that kept their aircraft mere feet above jungle canopies, wave tops, and island beaches. They were trading the security of altitude for the devastating advantage of surprise. Among the early skeptics was Lieutenant James Swett, fresh from Guadalcanal operations, and unconvinced that deliberately flying into the teeth of enemy defenses made tactical sense. His personal accounts, documented in post-war interviews, and his combat diary would chronicle one of the most dramatic evolutions in aviation warfare history. When I first heard the proposal to attack at Treetop height, Swett wrote in May 1944, I thought the planners had gone mad. Every instinct I had developed told me to maintain altitude. The idea of deliberately placing yourself where a single moment's inattention meant certain death seemed suicidal. The transformation had begun in the dense jungles of New Guinea, where Japanese forces had dispersed and concealed their positions so effectively that conventional bombing proved frustratingly ineffective. General George Kenney, commanding the 5th Air Force, faced a tactical problem that required unconventional solutions. If the enemy couldn't be engaged effectively from high altitude, perhaps the answer lay at the opposite extreme. The subsequent development of minimum altitude tactics would prove as revolutionary as they were counterintuitive, generating kill ratios and mission success rates that would have seemed impossible using conventional approaches. The challenges that drove the development of ultra-low altitude tactics emerged gradually throughout 1943 as American forces pushed westward across the Pacific. Conventional bombing from medium and high altitudes had proven devastatingly effective against concentrated industrial targets in Europe, but the dispersed, camouflaged nature of Japanese island defenses presented an entirely different problem. General George Kenney, commanding the 5th Air Force, expressed the frustration in a July 1943 communication to General MacArthur. "We're dropping thousands of pounds of explosives and seeing limited results. The enemy has adapted. We must do the same. The island-hopping campaign required neutralizing Japanese defensive positions that were increasingly sophisticated in their concealment. Traditional bombing from 15,000 to 25,000 feet was producing circular error probables of 300 to 500 feet, acceptable when targeting factories, but inadequate against bunkers, artillery positions, and supply caches hidden beneath jungle canopies. Intelligence reports from ground forces repeatedly highlighted how Japanese units remained combat effective despite days of preparatory bombing. Among the officers grappling with this tactical problem was Colonel Paul Wurtsmith, commander of the V Fighter Command. A veteran pilot with combat experience dating back to the Philippines in 1941, Wurtsmith had developed a reputation for unconventional thinking. In August 1943, following a particularly frustrating mission against positions near Lae, New Guinea, Wurtsmith gathered his squadron leaders for a tactical reassessment. "Gentlemen," he reportedly began, "we need to accept that we're fighting the wrong war with the right aircraft. Our tactics are based on the European conditions, but the Pacific demands something different." What followed was a radical proposal: deliberate, planned attacks at minimum possible altitude, directly into the teeth of enemy defenses. The skepticism was immediate and vocal. Major Thomas Lynch, commanding the 39th Fighter Squadron, summarized the concerns in his post-mission report. "The proposed approach violates every survival principle we've taught our pilots. We'd be deliberately placing ourselves in the envelope of every weapon the Japanese possess, from machine guns to small arms fire." Lynch wasn't alone. Staff officers calculated projected loss rates of 15 to 20% per mission, unsustainable by any measure. Yet preliminary data from reconnaissance pilots who had inadvertently flown at extremely low altitudes while evading Japanese fighters suggested something counterintuitive. Very low-level approaches actually reduced vulnerability to certain types of defensive fire. At altitudes below 50 feet, Japanese gunners struggled with tracking speeds and extreme depression angles. Their 25mm anti-aircraft guns and heavy machine guns, optimized for engagement at 1,000 to 8,000 feet, couldn't depress sufficiently to track aircraft skimming the terrain. On September 12, 1943, Wurtsmith authorized the first experimental minimum altitude strike against Japanese positions near Finschhafen. 6 P-38 Lightnings of the 39th Fighter Squadron approached from seaward at wave-top height, climbed briefly to clear the beach defenses, then dropped to 30 feet above the jungle canopy. The after-action report documented something remarkable: complete tactical surprise. Japanese defenders, conditioned to scan medium altitudes for approaching aircraft, never detected the Lightnings until they were directly overhead. All 6 aircraft returned without combat damage, having destroyed an estimated 8 defensive positions and a fuel depot. The mission's success contradicted every projection from the planning staff. Major Thomas Maguire, who would later become the second highest scoring American ace of the Pacific Theater, was among the first to recognize the broader implications. "We've stumbled onto something revolutionary," he wrote to Wurtsmith the following day. "The risk isn't in flying low, it's in being predictable. The Japanese have optimized their defenses for how they expect us to attack. By fundamentally changing that equation, we create vulnerabilities they cannot quickly address." By October 1943, what had begun as experimental tactics were becoming formalized doctrine. Lieutenant Colonel Neil Kirby's 348th Fighter Group began systematic training in low-level attack profiles, developing precise approaches that balanced terrain masking, sun positioning, and coordinated strikes. The skeptics remained numerous, but the operational results were becoming increasingly difficult to dismiss. The adoption of ultra-low altitude tactics required extensive modifications to both aircraft and pilot training procedures. By November 1943, dedicated maintenance teams were developing specialized configurations for P-47 Thunderbolts, F-4U Corsairs, and P-38 Lightnings operating in the Pacific Theater. These modifications addressed the unique challenges of sustained operation at altitudes where fighters had never been designed to function for extended periods. The massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engines powering both P-47s and Corsairs face particular challenges in the dense air at sea level. At full military power, these 18-cylinder radial engines generated over 2,000 horsepower, but also produced tremendous heat. Above 15,000 feet, thin air provided natural cooling. At treetop level, especially in the humid Pacific climate, engines risked overheating within minutes of sustained operation. Maintenance crews modified cooling baffles, installed additional oil coolers, and adjusted mixture settings to compensate. Chief Warrant Officer Raymond Town, heading maintenance for the 348th Fighter Group, documented the engineering challenges in his technical reports. "We've had to rethink everything about how these aircraft operate. We're installing special dust filters to prevent engine wear from the constant debris ingestion at low altitudes. We're reinforcing lower fuselage panels that were never designed for continuous stress from high-speed air compression at sea level." These modifications added weight, sometimes up to 200 pounds of additional equipment, but the trade-off was essential for aircraft expected to operate for hours at altitudes where the air was 25% denser than their design specifications anticipated. Propeller pitch settings required recalibration to maintain efficiency in the thicker air. Some pilots reported that their aircraft handled like flying through molasses compared to operations at higher altitudes. The P-38 Lightning, with its twin Allison engines and distinctive twin-boom design, required less extensive modifications but developed its own set of specialized procedures. Lieutenant Colonel Charles MacDonald, commanding the 425th Fighter Group equipped with P-38s, established a dedicated training program focused on terrain-following techniques. MacDonald's program included graduated altitude training, beginning at 500 feet and progressively working down to just 50 feet above various terrain types. His pilots practiced over water first, then advanced to flat ground, rolling terrain, and finally dense jungle, where visual references became particularly challenging. The training emphasized maintaining precise altitude while scanning simultaneously for targets, threats, and navigational references. The physiological demands on pilots were extreme. Captain James Hagerstrom described the experience in a letter home. "You're flying so low that everything becomes a blur. Your brain barely processes one visual cue before 10 more demand attention. It's exhausting in a way that's hard to describe. 3 hours of this leaves you completely drained, hands cramping from maintaining death grip pressure on the controls." Navigation presented a particular challenge. Traditional methods relied on visual checkpoints identified from medium altitudes where pilots could see for miles. At treetop level, visual references disappeared behind the aircraft within seconds. Pilots developed new techniques using riverbeds, coastlines, and distinctive terrain features as their guide paths. Mission planning now included detailed strip maps showing sequential visual references that would be visible from extreme low altitude. One unexpected aerodynamic advantage emerged during early operations. Aircraft flying below 50 feet experienced a phenomenon known as ground effect, the compression of air between the aircraft and the surface beneath it. This created a cushion of higher pressure that actually improved lift and reduced induced drag. Pilots discovered they could carry more ordnance while consuming less fuel when operating in this envelope. Lieutenant Robert de Haven of the 49th Fighter Group documented this effect in his mission reports. "We've found that our P-38s can carry two 1,000-pound bombs while using 15% less fuel when maintaining altitude between 30–40 feet. The aircraft feels more stable, responds more crisply to control inputs. It's counterintuitive, but the numbers don't lie." By December 1943, the first purpose-modified mud movers, as the pilots called them, were entering regular service. The 348th Fighter Group under Colonel Neil Kirby completed full conversion to low-altitude attack configurations, with adjusted maintenance schedules accounting for the increased stress on airframes and engines. The 475th's P-38s received specialized camouflage patterns with darker upper surfaces and lighter undersides, the reverse of traditional fighter camouflage, optimized for concealment when viewed from ground level. These technical adaptations formed the foundation for what would become one of the most effective tactical innovations of the Pacific Campaign. The engineering challenges had been substantial, but they paled in comparison to the combat advantages they enabled. The evolution of Treetop tactics accelerated dramatically between January and March 1944 as combat units transformed experimental approaches into systematic doctrine. Major William Dunham's 58th Fighter Group pioneered the hit-and-run methodology during operations over New Britain and New Ireland, refining the approach through dozens of combat sorties. Their tactical innovations focused on maximizing surprise while minimizing exposure to defensive fire. A typical mission profile began with careful study of Japanese defensive positions using intelligence gathered from coast watchers, reconnaissance flights, and prisoner interrogations. Pilots plotted approach corridors that utilized terrain masking, ridgelines, valleys, or island chains that concealed their approach until the final moments. These routes were calculated to place the rising or setting sun directly behind the attacking aircraft, further complicating target acquisition for defensive gunners. The 58th mission on February 12, 1944, against Japanese installations at Kavieng exemplified these refined tactics. 24 F-4U Corsairs approached from seaward at wave-top height, maintaining 30 feet of altitude for over 60 miles of open water navigation. The pilots flew in staggered pairs, separated by 500 yards to prevent defensive fire meant for one aircraft from accidentally hitting another. "We didn't see the shoreline until we were 15 seconds from weapons release," Captain Joseph Foss recorded in his combat report. "At 340 mph, we covered nearly 500 feet each second. The Japanese had precisely 3 seconds from when they first spotted us until our ordnance impacted their positions." This compression of reaction time proved devastating for defensive positions. Japanese gunners, even when alert, simply couldn't traverse and elevate their weapons quickly enough to engage aircraft approaching at such speeds from unexpected vectors. By the time defensive fire began, the attacking fighters were already executing their egress, disappearing behind terrain features or dropping back to wave-top height. The 475th Fighter Group, under Lieutenant Colonel Charles MacDonald, integrated these tactics with P-38 Lightning operations, adding a new dimension of coordinated multi-aircraft approaches. MacDonald developed what pilots called the lightning strike, multiple flights approaching from different directions, all arriving over the target within a 30-second window. This saturated defensive capabilities, preventing gunners from effectively engaging any single formation. During the Admiralty Islands campaign in March 1944, MacDonald's tactics received their most significant validation. Supporting the landing at Los Negros, 12 P-38s approached the Japanese defensive positions from 3 different directions simultaneously, all at altitudes below 50 feet. The after-action assessment documented 26 defensive positions neutralized with 0 aircraft losses. General Kenny personally commended MacDonald, noting that the same positions had previously withstood repeated conventional bombing from medium altitude. Captain Richard Bong, who would eventually become America's highest-scoring ace, described the psychological impact in a letter to his flight instructor. "The Japanese have been conditioned to expect our attacks from medium altitude. When we suddenly appear at eye level, it creates genuine panic. I've watched gun crews abandon their weapons rather than attempt to engage us." This psychological effect extended beyond the immediate tactical situation. Japanese defense planning had to account for threats from all altitudes, diluting their formerly concentrated anti-aircraft positions. Intercepted communications revealed growing frustration among Japanese commanders as they struggled to counter the American tactical flexibility. By April 1944, these tactics were being integrated with broader operational planning. During the Hollandia landings, P-47 Thunderbolts of the 348th Fighter Group conducted coordinated low-level strikes against Japanese airfields, approaching at treetop level from inland mountain passes rather than the expected seaward direction. Colonel Neil Kirby's mission planning specified precise timing, striking at 0710 hours when the morning sun would be at the optimal angle to blind defenders while providing sufficient light for accurate targeting. The statistical results spoke volumes. Against defended positions, Conventional medium-altitude attacks typically achieved 30 to 40% of targets neutralized with aircraft loss rates of 3 to 5%. Treetop tactics consistently neutralized 70–80% of identified targets with loss rates below 1%. More significantly, the losses that did occur typically resulted from mechanical failures or pilot error rather than enemy action. The turning point came during preparation for the Philippines campaign, when General MacArthur personally observed a demonstration of low-level tactics against simulated defensive positions. Watching F-4U Corsairs thunder across the practice range at 30 feet, delivering devastating accuracy while remaining virtually impossible to track with practice guns, MacArthur reportedly turned to General Kenny and remarked, "I've seen enough. Make this standard procedure for all preliminary operations." By September 1944, what had begun as a desperate tactical experiment had transformed into formal doctrine, documented in 5th Air Force Field Manual 44-3. Low-level attack procedures against dispersed defensive positions. The counterintuitive approach of deliberately flying into the teeth of enemy defenses had proven itself the safest and most effective method of neutralizing Japanese positions. The statistical validation of ultra-low altitude tactics during the Philippines campaign of late 1944 and early 1945 transformed what had been an innovative approach into the primary strike methodology throughout the Pacific theater. Intelligence analysis from October 1944 through March 1945 documented mission success rates exceeding 80% for treetop-level attacks against hardened Japanese positions, compared to 35 to 40% effectiveness for conventional medium-altitude bombing. Even more striking were the survivability statistics. 5th Air Force records showed that properly executed minimum altitude missions experienced loss rates of 0.8% per sortie, substantially lower than the 4.7% average for medium-altitude bombing missions against the same target types. The invasion of Lingayen Gulf in January 1945 represented perhaps the most comprehensive demonstration of these tactics. 3 days before the main landing, 48 P-47 Thunderbolts from the 348th Fighter Group conducted coordinated strikes against Japanese coastal defenses. The official after-action report described their approach. Aircraft maintained 15 to 20 feet altitude over 85 nautical miles of open water, increasing to 30 feet only for final weapons delivery. Total mission duration 2 hours 15 minutes. Results: 38 of 42 identified defensive positions neutralized. 0 aircraft lost to enemy action. The psychological impact on Japanese defenders proved as significant as the physical destruction. A captured Japanese officer from the 8th Division later described the effect. "We had practiced for months against American bombing from above. Our shelters were hardened, our guns positioned for high-angle fire. When the Americans began appearing at eye level, the psychological shock was overwhelming. Many gunners simply abandoned their positions rather than face what seemed like certain death." The tactical application expanded dramatically during this period. Lieutenant Colonel Charles MacDonald of the 475th Fighter Group adapted the approach for interdiction of Japanese shipping. His P-38 Lightnings approached at wave-top height from the direction of the rising or setting sun, using specialized skip bombing techniques that allowed 500-pound bombs to strike ship hulls at their waterlines. During the Ormoc Bay operations in December 1944, these tactics resulted in the destruction of 11 Japanese transport vessels with minimal aircraft losses. Colonel Paul Wurtsmith, promoted to command the 13th Air Force in January 1945, expanded the methodology to larger-scale operations. The neutralization of Clark Field before the Luzon landings demonstrated the scalability of the approach. Rather than the traditional multi-day medium-altitude bombing campaign, Wurtsmith authorized a massive single-day operation with 96 fighters approaching from 3 directions simultaneously, all at altitudes below 100 feet until the final seconds before target acquisition. The legacy of ultra-low altitude tactics extended far beyond the conclusion of World War II, influencing combat aircraft development and tactical doctrine for decades. Post-war analysis conducted by the newly formed United States Air Force in 1947 formally acknowledged what Pacific theater pilots had demonstrated empirically. Properly executed minimum altitude approaches offered superior survivability against certain types of defensive systems, while delivering unmatched accuracy against dispersed targets. The Korean conflict from 1950–1953 saw these lessons applied with devastating effect, particularly during the fluid front lines of 1950–51. F-51 Mustangs, redesignated from P-51, of the 18th Fighter Bomber Wing, maintained the tactical approach pioneered in the Pacific, with pilots routinely operating at altitudes below 100 feet during interdiction missions against North Korean supply lines. Major Louis Sabile, posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor, employed these tactics during his final mission on August 5, 1950, approaching North Korean anti-aircraft positions at Treetop level before delivering a devastating attack that cost him his life, but neutralized defensive positions threatening advancing American ground forces. Colonel Dean Hess, commanding the 12th Fighter Bomber Squadron in Korea, had studied Pacific campaign reports extensively. "The tactical principles remain unchanged," Hess wrote in his operational assessment in November 1950. "Surprise through unexpected approach vectors, compression of enemy reaction time through high speed at minimum altitude, and immediate egress to positions of relative safety. What worked against Japanese defensive positions proves equally effective against communist forces in Korea." The evolution continued through the early Cold War period, with the development of dedicated fighter-bomber aircraft specifically designed for low-altitude penetration. The Republic F-105 Thunder Chief, entering service in 1958, incorporated lessons learned from Treetop operations, reinforced lower fuselage panels, enhanced cooling systems for sustained low-altitude flight, and terrain-following radar systems that allowed pilots to maintain minimum clearance even in conditions of limited visibility. Vietnam presented new challenges, but reinforced the same fundamental principles. Colonel Robin Olds, who commanded the 8th Tactical Fighter Wing during Operation Bolo in 1967, had studied the Pacific campaign extensively. His approach to defeating North Vietnamese air defenses incorporated many elements pioneered by Wurtsmith and Kirby: unexpected vectors, compressed reaction times, and multi-directional coordinated strikes. Though the operating environment had changed dramatically with the introduction of radar-guided surface-to-air missiles, the psychological principle of surprise remained equally valid. The technical requirements for successful minimum altitude operations drove significant engineering innovations. The development of terrain-following radar systems in the 1960s automated what Pacific pilots had done through visual reference and precise map reading. The F-111 Aardvark incorporated a radar system that could maintain preset clearance as low as 200 feet while traveling at speeds approaching 600 mph in all visibility conditions. This technology traced its conceptual lineage directly to the tactical problems first encountered over New Guinea and the Philippines. Modern combat aircraft like the F-15E Strike Eagle and F-16 Fighting Falcon incorporate sophisticated terrain-following systems that allow sustained operations at altitudes below 100 feet while traveling at supersonic speeds. These capabilities, representing the culmination of decades of development, remain firmly rooted in the tactical principles first discovered when desperate circumstances forced Pacific pilots to abandon conventional doctrine. Major General Charles MacDonald, reflecting on the tactical evolution he had helped pioneer, observed shortly before his death in 1991, "What we discovered through necessity and developed through experience was that conventional wisdom often represents merely the accumulated assumptions of previous conflicts. The pilot willing to challenge those assumptions, to fly lower than anyone thought practical, faster than anyone thought safe, often discovers advantages that no amount of theoretical analysis could predict." January 14, 1945. Lingayen Gulf, Philippines. Major William Dunham's low-level strike against Japanese defensive positions had not represented merely an isolated tactical success, but the validation of principles that would reshape air combat for generations. The mission that day demonstrated something profound about military innovation. The most significant advancements often emerge not from comfortable theoretical development, but from the desperate need to solve seemingly impossible tactical problems. The counterintuitive discovery that flying directly toward enemy guns at treetop height could prove safer than maintaining supposedly secure altitude continues to influence modern air combat doctrine. The willingness to challenge conventional wisdom, to embrace calculated risk in pursuit of decisive advantage, remains the hallmark of successful tactical innovation. As General Kenny wrote in his memoirs, the moment a pilot decides that altitude itself represents safety, he has surrendered the initiative to the enemy. What the treetop flyers discovered was that safety lies not in distance from the threat, but in denying the enemy the ability to effectively respond to your presence. When you appear where they don't expect you, moving faster than they can react, you've created a temporal sanctuary more secure than any physical distance could provide. The legacy of those Pacific pilots who first dared to deliberately abandon the safety of altitude continues in every modern air campaign, where surprise, speed, and unpredictability remain the fundamental elements of tactical success. Their discovery that sometimes the safest path lies directly through the heart of danger stands as one of the most counterintuitive yet enduring principles in the evolution of aerial warfare.